So this is our WSQ for the Civil War unit. The WSQ is going to be over the war at home. Remember that you're going to watch, you're going to summarize, and then you're going to ask 3 hot questions. So again, that's going to be from this sheet here, your Bloom's Taxonomy action verbs. It needs to be the analysis, the synthesis, and the evaluation category. So make sure that you have that handy. All right, so the war at home. We've been looking a lot at how soldiers fight in battle, and we haven't really looked too much about how the war affected life in the Union and the Confederate States of America. So we'll start with the Union. And with the Union, the Republican Party, which was Lincoln's party, was able to easily pass all kinds of legislation that's going to be nationalistic. So nationalistic is going to work for the benefit of the country. So they're going to pass all of this legislation, and there's not going to be really any opposition because remember, in 1860, the Republicans became associated with the North and with abolitionism, and the Democrats became associated with the South and with slavery. So it's mostly a Republican Congress, and they're able to pass what they want to get through. So they're going to pass all these programs that are going to boost the United States, and it's going to promote economic development because even in war, they want to keep the cash flow constantly coming in. Now, one of the things that's going to be nationalistic is a further move west. Now, we talked about manifest destiny, and we talked about this idea that God had somehow granted Americans with this unfettered right to take what lie to the west. The Homestead Act is going to just move into that territory. It's going to be a way to get people out into some of the other lands that are not as heavily settled or populated, places like Iowa and Nebraska. And so the Homestead Act of 1862, this is where you're going to see people go out and move onto this land that they can get for very, very cheaply. And the only stipulation is they have to stay on it for a specified amount of time, usually 5 years, and they have to improve the land. Now, that's a tough job. As you can see here, or if you've ever been out in Kansas and Nebraska, it's a lot of flat plain. The soil is not great for a lot of farming in a lot of areas. It takes a lot of work to really produce something really well. So you hear about sod busters, and these are these people that move out west with the Homestead Act and establish these lives out there. So another thing that they do that's similar to the Homestead Act is called the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862. And again, it's going to sell lands in the West, and most of the money from this is going to go towards colleges. They're called land grant colleges. A couple of the big ones you can see commemorated here on this 1955 stamp is Michigan State and Pennsylvania State, and those were funded directly by the funds raised by the Morrill Land Grant Act. And again, it was like the Homestead Act. It had stipulations, and it was to put people into lands on the West. So here you can see a map of the land grant colleges to see just how effective this program was for the United States and for the Confederate States as well. 1862, you can see the red dots, the colleges that spring up, and you see several that are founded in the early Confederacy. 1890, you can see with the star, and then 1994 even. So a lot of benefit that came from that for a lot of people. But another thing that they do, these Republican congressmen, is that they pass these high tariff bills. And a tariff, we said, was a tax, and it was to protect industry. And so in order to keep the American economy, and when I say that, I mean the United States economy humming and business humming, they're going to pass these high tariff acts on anything that's an import. So it's buy American during wartime, and that's pretty common. We see that during World War I, we see that during World War II. So, okay, another nationalistic endeavor with the West, and you'll notice that a lot of those efforts involve the West, is the Transcontinental Railroad. So you've got a line starting in Omaha, Nebraska, you've got a line starting in Sacramento, California, and they start moving together. The one from Omaha moves west, the one from Sacramento moved east, and they meet at Promontory Point, Utah, and they create the Transcontinental Railroad. So now it is possible to go from coast to coast in the United States of America. So, finally, the thing that started, the shift that started in the 1840s with people moving out to California, initially in search of gold, is going to finally be complete. We just see during the war, even though most of the fighting is happening on the eastern part of the United States, it's happening east of the Mississippi River, there's all of this action that's going on west of Missouri and west of the Mississippi River that you don't often hear talked about as much. So we are claiming the West as the war goes on. And this is going to lead to a problem with Native Americans, which we'll get to in a couple units, because they have their own kind of war going with the United States during this time, and a war over land and land rights. Okay, we said that the Republicans in the United States, they also promoted an economic success plan. And one of those attempts to bolster the economy is the National Bank Acts. And that's going to take place 1863, 1864. And that's going to be the production of these things called greenbacks. And so it's no longer credit notes, and it's no longer a lot of independent notes from states. Before this, every state has different notes, and the values vary depending on where you are and what region you're in and what state you're in, and it's a lot of fluctuation. And so they're just trying to balance out the financial system here in the United States during war. And so these bank acts create a common currency, and it got a lot of criticism in this political cartoon from the time. There, you can see Lincoln there with his head kicked back and he's laughing. All this reminds me of a most capital joke. And so you've got Chase's patent greenback mill. So the joke was that these greenbacks were not worth much money at all. And so they just keep pumping them out more and more and more. So even though it was an attempt to try to lift the economy of the United States, it actually didn't really affect it that much in terms of success. There was an old saying that you don't hear anymore, but people would say, well, that's not worth a greenback dollar, because their prices fluctuated so much during the war. All right, now, to finance the war, because war is expensive, and the United States is fielding a massive military, Army and Navy. And so, for the first time in American history, we have an income tax in 1861, and that's going to go to fund the war effort. We also have paper currency in the forms of those greenbacks, and we have a lot of borrowing by the federal government. Now, besides money, you need bodies, and so to fill the ranks for the Union, they relied on 90-day volunteers. And really, at the start of the war, both sides believed that this conflict would be over in 90 days. Now, as it drug on and we realized that the war is not going to end quite so quickly and optimistically, the volunteer enlistments lengthened to 3 years. But still, this was a voluntary military for the Union. In 1863, however, because enlistments were down so much, they passed a draft law, and if your name got called, you went into military service. Now, that was the case unless you could pay the government $300. If you could pay your way out, then that was going to equal safety. You could also pay a substitute to go instead, and newspapers from the time are full of columns of substitute wanted, substitute needed, and it would tell how much they would pay. Now, you could make pretty good money, anywhere from $300 up to $1,000. It just depended on who was paying, how desperately they did not want to go. So it was a way to make money. It was a dangerous way, but it was a way. And this draft law is not going to be popular at all in the North, especially among certain groups of individuals. In 1863, we're going to see the draft riots of New York. It's going to just be these massive outbursts of violence, especially from areas like the 5 Points of New York, which is one of the poorest sections of the city at the time. And they're going to move into some of the wealthier neighborhoods. They're going to destroy homes. There's going to be a lot of physical attacks, a lot of burning and looting and pillaging. There's going to be a lot of hanging of African Americans, some of which were accused of being the reason behind the war, some of which because they were taking jobs away from white laborers. So it's going to be a huge, huge outcry against the draft riots in New York. And here you can see how some of the burnings took place and how some of the physical attacks went down, major clashes between police and the federal army and protesters. So the strongest draft opposition from this group is going to come from laborers, immigrants, and copperheads. And copperheads are going to be people who were like this man here, who was a politician. He advocated a peace with the Confederacy that would end the war. So they were nicknamed so because they were dangerous, venomous serpents who laid in the grass and wait for their opportunity to strike. So copperheads, it could be applied to either side. It was usually applied to the Republicans because the Republicans were supposed to be as known as this abolitionist party who supported Lincoln and his cause with the war. So if they went against that and wanted to sue for peace with the Confederacy, that was considered a copperhead action, but it could be Democrats as well. And this is Clement Vallandigham, and he was one of the most well-known copperheads. All right, new opportunities for women in the Union. You're going to see men going to war, and so you're going to be women becoming teachers, sales clerks, office workers, mill and factory hands. So they're going to take on positions that they had not been able to take on before. By far, the most well-known field was nursing. And we're going to see groups like the U.S. Sanitary Commission arise that are going to hold these sanitary fairs to educate people on proper hygiene and clean living. You're going to see these ladies and men go into the field and care for soldiers, provide care packages. So nursing was a huge profession, and there was a huge cause for it. When we talk about medicine, we'll see just how extensive the need for aid because of all these soldiers coming in was. Okay, so that was the Union. As far as the Confederacy goes, the most challenging job of the new government was financing the war. Because remember, the Confederacy is starting from scratch here. They do not have a long political tradition. All right, just like the Union, they promote a paper currency in 1861. They impose income taxes in 1863, so a couple years after the Union, and they sell bonds, which is where citizens would pay money and then collect interest on the bonds that they sold. They could cash those out at a later time. As far as bodies to fill the rank here in the Confederacy, they're going to call for volunteers at first as well, just like the Union. But it's going to be desperate enough for them that they're going to call a draft a year earlier than the Union does. So the Union calls a draft in 63, the Confederacy calls one in 62. And again, that just shows you the manpower that the Union had over the Confederacy. Now, just like the Union, one could buy a replacement, or if you owned 20 or more slaves, you could be exempt. So from 1861 to 1862, you could have a couple ways out of this. If you owned 20 or more slaves, or you could buy a replacement, you were okay. But after 1862, starting with 1863, that's not going to be an option anymore because the South is becoming more and more desperate. So these actions at home show you how desperate they become. When we study battles, we don't really see that as much, but here we can see it. And this led a lot of people to say it's a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Because if you're rich, you can buy your way out of it. If you're rich, you're going to be in the throes of power, and the poor men are going to be the ones filling the ranks. Now, life in the South was terrible during the war, mainly because of the blockade, or largely because of the blockade. They have no trade overseas for a significant amount of time. They have no trade with the North. You've got men who are off fighting, and so you've got the old and the very young and women at home minding the farms. And remember that a lot of the South was not this mythical land of huge plantations with over 300 slaves. They were small white farmers.